Okay, so the second part of the formula is aperture. So when we talk about aperture, we're referring to the background of your image. So I want to show you these two photographs that are in the PowerPoint. As you can see in this photograph, the background is entirely a blur. Whereas in this photograph, the background is very crystal clear and you can see everything that's happening. These are two very different apertures. When we talk about apertures, we're talking about a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field. Aperture controls the depth of field in your photographs. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest objects that are in focus. So there's two different depths of field, and we're gonna write them on our timeline. Let me find my pen. We're gonna write aperture at the top of our timeline. And we're gonna write the two depths of field. So the first one is shallow and deep. When we talk about aperture, we talk about our f-stop, which is kind of weird. Aperture is expressed in f-stops. I'll go ahead and write that on your timeline as well, f-stops. So when a fellow photographer says, like, what's your aperture? You're gonna be like, oh, my f-stop is at 1.8, or I'm at f13, all of that jazz. Okay, so with a shallow depth of field, we're gonna talk about what's happening in the background. So on our cameras, the most shallow depth of field, or the lowest the aperture can go, is f3.5. So at f3.5, we're gonna get an image a lot like this, where we have a blur in the background, and you can't really see any of the background detail in this photograph at all. So let's go ahead and write that down. We're gonna have a blurred background. Then we're also, when we take a photograph at f3.5, our lens opening is actually bigger, which is kind of weird because 3.5, you would think the lens opening would be smaller, but it's actually much bigger. So let's go ahead and draw our lens opening and write more light. Because the bigger the lens opening, the more light it is letting into our photographs. So if we set our f-stop at 3.5, we're gonna let more light in. The average f-stop, which is like for your camera, for your iPhone's f-stop is usually around like f10, somewhere around there. And at f10, your background is still pretty clear, but there might be a little bit blur in the distance. Awesome. The deepest f-stop that you can get, the deepest depth of field and the most detailed background is going to be at f32, and that's how deep these cameras can go. At f32, this is great for landscapes when you want to see all the detail in your photograph, and we're going to have a more detailed background. We're also going to have a smaller lens opening. So as you can see, as we get close, that kind of didn't get bigger. As we get closer to this side, your lens opening gets bigger the smaller you get. So this is going to let in less light. That's aperture. I think that's all you really need to know. Let's fill out the notes. Aperture controls the depth of field in your photograph. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest objects that are in focus. Aperture is expressed in f-stops. Shallow depth of field is going to mean a smaller number, but a bigger opening. Deep depth of field means a bigger number or a larger number, but a smaller opening. F5.6 is a shallow depth of field and a blurred background. F20 is going to be a deep depth of field with a detailed or a clear background. Awesome, that's Aperture.